This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, an update from the market. So Prosus and Naspers, they may have had a rather crap run last week, but today was pretty different at the JSE. Both firms are up over 3% in today's trading session. They accounted for the bulk of the 1% move in the top 40 that we saw in South Africa. If you're keen on sub-Saharan financial firms, a couple of things to add to your calendar. ABSA's Kenyan subsidiary is reporting its half-year results on the 26th. Nation Media Group, that's the largest media firm in East Africa, is reporting its half-year numbers in another 10 hours. Shares in both companies are up 9% and 62% respectively so far in the year. Here's what's coming up tonight. Unemployment soars to historic levels in South Africa. Egypt plans to issue Sukuk bonds in order to manage its deficit. And G7 leaders are holding a virtual meeting to respond to developments in Afghanistan. Let's start the hour with the latest macro data out of South Africa. Unemployment over there has hit a record high of 34.4%. Essentially, in that country, there are nearly 8 million people right now out of a job. This is the highest unemployment rate recorded by Stats SA since the survey started back in 2008. Now, previously, the unemployment rate stood at 32.6%. In the first quarter of the year, the number of jobless people was 7.2 million at that point. The expanded definition of unemployment, which accounts for those discouraged from seeking work, has gone up by 120 basis points to 44.4%. The Eastern Cape recorded the highest unemployment rate, 47.1%, and the expanded unemployment rate there is 53%. Formal sector employment, which accounts for about 68% or so of total employment, that saw a loss of 375,000 jobs in total during the quarter. But employment in the informal sector, private households and agriculture did go up. Angela Coppola now joins us from Johannesburg to help make more sense of the data out of Start to Say today. So, Angela, the median estimate for unemployment in Q2 was around 33.2%. The final print was way higher. So what exactly pushed the rate as high as it was in the second quarter, and what reactions are you getting?
Well, the data that we're seeing from economists is suggesting that there was a 1.8% jump, in fact, at a normalized level. Not that's excluding the expanded level of unemployment. We saw the so-called discouraged people coming back to the markets to look for work, and those discouraged people included people from last year. There was that 1.4 million job losses that happened last year. So many of those were coming back to the market this year, or in this second quarter, to look for work because they thought they might find a job. And then, of course, there was the issue of about 300,000 odd people who are still, or newly discouraged people who are now looking in the job market as well. And according to Stats SA's boss, he reckons that there's now 11.9 million unemployed people in South Africa, according to him anyway. And this jump shocked and horrified, and I use those words advisedly because that's the words that were coming out of the economists' mouths. At that number, they were expecting between 0.1% movement in either direction, either up or down for this second quarter. So not good news, and there's shock and horror around everywhere right now, Ramah.
Why did the finance sector have the biggest net change in jobs, shedding nearly 300,000 roles to essentially go back to where employment levels were in the second quarter of 2020?
Well, that number was slightly lower, but I mean, the bottom line here is it's all shed in one quarter. That's 3 months. And that sector includes financial intermediation, insurance, real estate, and business services. The real estate and business services sectors were the biggest losers there, less so the financial services sector. And that includes insurance intermediary services as well. So the impact of COVID on SMEs in the business services sector was huge, in fact. The depth of that damage that happened could actually be seen in the hike in liquidations in the sector. In fact, over 1/3 of all liquidations between January and June were in the SME business services sector. So not looking good there, and lots of people liquidating themselves to get themselves out of trouble. Ramah.
Okay, so one last question for you, Angelo. In as much as this data set is horrifying, to paraphrase what you said earlier from The Economist, between the wave of riots you saw in July, tighter pandemic restrictions, this number could go even higher in the third quarter of the year, couldn't it? What are economists forecasting for that period?
Well, the economists I spoke to say that quarter three isn't going to be pretty. Their words again. Those I spoke to say that it's almost a foregone conclusion that the number's going to get worse. They were expecting to see some improvement in the jobs number in this quarter following moves by government to restructure and restart the economy with that iteration of a new restructuring and redevelopment plan, especially when it comes to the expanded business works program, because that's where they can pump numbers into, but it didn't happen. And then also we're hearing that the private sector is also apparently sitting on its hands and not creating jobs or business opportunities just yet. The impact of the riots, of course, will be significant, despite the reduced quantum of insurance claims that the state insurer has received so far. In fact, National Treasury now estimates that the riots could cause a 0.7 percentage to 0.9 percentage point drop in GDP at the end of the year. So it's definitely not going to be a pretty picture, Ramah.
Indeed, we'll have to wait and see what that data set looks like when it does come out. It will not make for pretty reading. Angela Kopler in Johannesburg. Thank you. Now, the trial of one of the biggest corruption scandals in Mozambique opened on Monday in a prison in Maputo. 19 people are accused of blackmail, forgery, embezzlement and money laundering. Several million euros are at stake here, and these are going to be heard over the next 2 months. Among the accused is the son of the former president, Armando Guebuza. Ndambi Guebuza is a man in question. Between 2013 and 2014, 3 Mozambican state-owned companies, Pro Indicus, Emitim and MALM, took out over $2 billion in loans, and that included debt raised from Credit Suisse and the Russian bank VTB. Ostensibly, the money was to finance maritime surveillance, fishing and shipyard projects, but that did not happen. Zimbabwe, in the meantime, is forecasting cotton production for the current 2020-2021 season will surpass 150,000 tons. If that happens, it would be the highest yield in nearly 5 years and nearly double what was produced during the previous season. Here's CGTN's Ramah Nyang with the details from Harare.
In recent years, Zimbabwe's government has tried to revive cotton production by providing farmers with subsidized inputs and expanding agricultural extension services. The efforts are paying off if this season's output is anything to go by.
We are forecasting to buy 150,000 metric tons, up from last year. Last year we only managed to achieve 82,400 metric tons. So it's close to doubling the output that we got last year. We got the bulk of our inputs on time. As you know, farming is about timing. We got our inputs on time and got them to the farmers on time. So when the rains came, the farmers were ready to plant.
Consistent rainfall in the traditionally arid cotton-growing regions will help grow production of the white gold by 83%. The expansion is expected to have a transformative impact on the hard-hit areas and the economy in general.
So when you look at the societal benefits, it actually uplifts the standard of living for those people. It's part of our poverty alleviation programs. When we have a cash crop like cotton, it helps those marginalized people who cannot grow other crops.
Zimbabwe exports about 70% of its cotton, bringing in an average of $85 million per annum. A hardier seed designed to combat climate change has been developed to sustain production growth.
Now that hybrid seed is giving us a much better yield compared to our existing varieties. We're talking of current varieties are doing about 300 kgs of cotton per hectare due to these adverse weather conditions. But the hybrid seed, under the same conditions, is giving us a minimum of 1,500 kgs.
Zimbabwe's next priority is value addition, so it upgrades from exporting raw lint to making yarn and restoring its capacity for manufacturing fabric and clothing. Increased availability of cottonseed is also expected to bolster the cooking oil and stock feed production value chains. Ramah Nyang, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
All right, then a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in Uganda. Umeme Limited, it's the distributor and supplier of electricity in the country of Uganda, and it's also listed at the Nairobi Securities Exchange. It's reported a net profit of $13.5 million for the first half of the year. Compare that to the $6.1 million it reported in the same period in 2020. Revenue from contracts with clients went up to nearly $260 million, up from $237.7 million in H1 2020. Pre-tax earnings doubled from $9 million last year to $19.5 million in the first half of 2021. Kenya's Cooperative Bank has extended its joint venture with South Sudan's government by another 3 years. The two entities formed the Cooperative Bank of South Sudan back in 2013, with the Kenyan banking multinational taking a controlling stake of 51%. The state took up the remaining equity, which it was to hold in trust and then later transfer to the cooperative movement in that country in a few years. Coop Bank points out that the transfer of that minority stake has been delayed by economic and political challenges in Africa's youngest country. Samsung has unveiled an over $200 billion expansion plan to create some 10,000 new jobs over 3 years, taking its total hiring to some 40,000 positions. The sprawling investment blueprint is intended to build the South Korean conglomerate's lead in next-generation tech. Samsung Electronics and affiliates like Samsung Biologics aim to lead research and spending in a whole host of areas, from telecommunications to robotics, and also they're going to spend a bit of money on corporate acquisitions. And finally, the online accommodation platform Airbnb says it will house some 20,000 African refugees at no charge to help them resettle around the world. The company's boss, Brian Chesky, says that the move was in response to what he described as, quote, one of the biggest humanitarian crises of our time, end of quote. He added that the firm felt a responsibility to step up. Now, the offer starts immediately. The company says it's working with NGOs on the ground to help with the most pressing of needs. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Egypt plans to issue Sukuk bonds in order to help manage its fiscal deficit. And Zambia's new president is pledging to fix the country's ailing economy. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Naidoo. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Egypt's non-oil exports recorded a 22% year-on-year increase in the first 7 months of 2021 to just over $17.6 billion. Now compare that to $14.6 billion recorded in the same period last year. The North African state's exports are up 46% to the EU, 25% higher to markets in Asia and Africa. Here's Yasser Kim with the details from Cairo.
Non-petroleum exports in the North African state have been recovering in 2021, reaching $17.7 billion from about $14.55 billion in the first 7 months in 2020. Food, agricultural products and chemicals remained top of the list, but there are sectors that have grown at faster rates, such as medical production, which rose 44% due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and textile exports, which jumped 45%.
What we are witnessing is an increase in demand after a slowdown in international trade due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Egypt is becoming a main supplier because it is closer to the EU and the US, the two largest markets. Targeting new markets is also important. Africa is a minute segment of our total exports, and therefore there should be more focus on it in the future, especially after the launch of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which is made up of 45 countries and about 1.3 billion people. It is a huge market that we should turn to, but it will need effort and time.
The largest recipient of Egyptian products are the EU and Arab states at about $5.5 billion each, while Africa stands at only $1.7 billion. Meanwhile, the government has been supporting producers to keep their factories operating and avoiding closures from the fallout caused by the pandemic.
There were some support programs aimed at small and medium enterprises. The central bank also provided funding at low 5% interest loans to industries. As board members in the Industries Federation, we are working with the government on solving a wide range of issues, like the very expensive fees slapped on factories from different government entities. Another problem is the complications we face when importing raw materials.
The government has also been providing tax incentives and subsidies to exporters to help them become more competitive in international markets and guarantee a further increase in exports. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And we're still in the North African economy. Egypt is preparing to issue its first sovereign sukuk, or Sharia-compliant Islamic bonds, during the second half of the current fiscal year. The exact timing and the size of the first offering that is yet to be determined. Egypt's finance ministry says the returns on sukuks, which could be offered in local or foreign currencies, would also be taxed in the same way as Egyptian treasury bonds. The government plans to use the money raised through sukuks to help fund its social and economic development projects. Now, throughout September and October 2020, Egypt also tapped into a different kind of a debt market. Egypt issued its first government-backed green bond worth about $750 million, and it listed it both domestically and on the London stock market. These were the first bonds of their kind issued from the Middle East and North Africa. Zambia's newly elected president, Hakainde Hichilema, has promised to rebuild the country's ailing economy as he was sworn into office on Tuesday. Mr. Hichilema was inaugurated at a ceremony attended by a whole host of leaders, including the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, South Africa, and representatives from Kenya too. Zambia's second female vice president, Mutale Nalumango, was also sworn in during the ceremony. In his sixth bid for the presidency, Mr. Hichilema defeated the incumbent, Edgar Lungu, by nearly 1 million votes in an election spurred by economic turmoil. Zambia is plagued by colossal levels of public debt, corruption, runaway inflation, and a currency that collapsed by 50% in value against the American dollar last year. COVID-19 has, of course, worsened the crisis even further. According to the World Bank, lockdown measures pushed Zambia into its first recession since 1998 last year. Economic output there contracted by 1.2%.
Unless our citizens participate in this process, we will create a sense of alienation, and no one will be safe in such an environment. We are intertwined, we can share common benefits, common value from the process of development. That is possible. It just needs a clever and smart way of mixing it up, and we will do that.
Mr. Hakainde Hichilema there, after he was sworn in at the National Hero Stadium. Now, he will be Zambia's 7th head of state since the country became independent. Here's CGTN's Wanja Mungai on the expectations
the swearing
of his
in of the former With the swearing in of the former businessman, they are hoping for change with the new regime.
We want things to change. Things are not okay. The dollar is high. Things are hard, and we want things to at least get back to normal. At least we are able to manage because things are hard. We want to change the government so that things can go back to normal.
They decry bad economic times characterized by unemployment and inflation. The former president Edgar Lungu's government is accused of investing in infrastructural projects that have left the country heavily indebted.
This past election was mainly about two things: the economy and the rule of law. What happened in the last 10 years is that the outgoing government built a lot of infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, expansion of airports and many other public infrastructure. But that also came with an additional cost of debt. So there was a huge increase in the country's foreign debt portfolio from around 2 billion to the official figure now is 12 point something billion dollars.
Hichilema won the elections with more than 2.8 million votes compared to Lungu's 1.8 million. 58-year-old Hichilema was mainly supported by young people. They believe that he's a game changer in a country that experienced inflation of 22% in February. It comes at a time when the coronavirus pandemic has strained economies worldwide. The World Bank says the pandemic has pushed Zambia into its first recession since 1998. The Southern African country is also looking forward to an era of democratic restoration following intimidation from the military just before elections. Hichilema will be Zambia's 7th president since independence. He will be leading the South African country, which has earned a reputation as one of Africa's most stable nations. This is due to smooth transitions of power since independence through the founding father, late Kenneth Kaunda. Wanjamungai, CGTN.
Owners of small enterprises in South Sudan are struggling to adapt to the numerous challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as CGTN's Patrick Oyet now reports, some of these SMEs are saying that high taxes are simply forcing them out of business.
Anthony Moga is a 23-year-old who owns a restaurant in the capital, Juba. Moga started using the internet to communicate with his clients when the country went into lockdown due to COVID-19. He sends out messages through WhatsApp, Facebook. He also sends short messaging service or SMS. Moga supplies more than 80 people with food in a day compared to about 30 people he used to serve prior to going online. However, he says his business faces a number of challenges.
On the side of the city council, whereby you find the taxes are too high, and there are some taxes which are imposed whereby you don't understand the reasons why they tax on this, and they don't demand. If you demand for further explanation, you're not given to.
One information communications technology expert says online business could have a bright future in the country.
One of the things that will need to be available for online businesses to prosper in South Sudan is access to capital, giving youth the tools that they need to make sure that these businesses work.
Another challenge for many here is that the internet infrastructure is still very poor. Some experts say only 10% of South Sudan's population has access to internet. The government says it is working to connect the entire country with mobile networks, and that would also connect the larger population to the internet. South Sudan's capital, Juba, is not yet properly demarcated. When it rains, some of the roads within the city become impassable, making it difficult to locate clients for online businesses. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. G7 heads of state hold a virtual meeting to respond to the latest developments in Afghanistan. And tourists return to Italy after pandemic restrictions were lifted. The details coming up next.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour, starting in Nigeria. Officials over there say that gunmen have killed 2 military personnel. This attack took place at an army training college in Kaduna State. The academy spokesperson, Major Bashir Muhtajira, says that the gunmen gained access to the area early in the morning. According to him, one soldier was kidnapped by the attackers. Army units and other security agencies are reportedly attempting to rescue the kidnapped individual. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab insurgents are said to have ambushed a military base at Galmudug. Eyewitnesses in Amara say that the assault happened on Tuesday morning. A suicide bomber is said to have detonated a device before gunmen then launched attacks on the base. It's not yet clear how many people were killed in the strike. Before government forces took over Amara, it had been a stronghold of the militant group Al-Shabaab. And Zambia's newly elected president, Hakainde Hichilema, has been sworn in. The veteran opposition figure won the presidential election by nearly 1 million votes. It's a pretty significant margin. This election marked Mr. Hichilema's 6th attempt vying for the presidency. The new president comes into office as Zambia faces a whole range of economic challenges. Key among them, the country's inflation rate, which had broke past 22% earlier this year, and the country's large public debt load. That's a run through your headlines. On to matters further afield now. As you might have heard, the United States Food and Drug Administration has given full approval to the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. How might that full approval, though, impact vaccination rates in the US? Owen Fairclough explains from Washington.
Can full approval of Pfizer's vaccine for those aged 16 and above persuade more people in the US to take the shot? With COVID-19 deaths at their highest since the spring, the Food and Drug Administration, who'd initially given Pfizer emergency authorization last year, hopes so, as does President Joe Biden.
If you're a business leader, a nonprofit leader, a state or local leader who has been waiting for full FDA approval to require vaccinations, I call on you now to do that. Require it.
More than 200 million people in the US have received Pfizer's 2-dose shot, with just over 60% of the population over 12 fully vaccinated with all vaccines. But it's a measure of US polarization over the pandemic that even Donald Trump's most fervent supporters reacted badly to him backing vaccines at a weekend rally in Alabama.
It's good, take the vaccines, but no, that's okay, that's all right. You got your freedoms.
Vaccine mandates are becoming more frequent for public sector workers in cities like San Francisco and New York. And the Department of Defense is now planning mandatory vaccines for the military.
If Pfizer has set another milestone in this pandemic, the FDA has yet to fully authorize its vaccine for use in 12 to 15-year-olds, as well as any of the vaccines offered by rivals Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. And the FDA also needs to sign off on Biden's plan to offer 100 million additional booster shots from the 20th of September. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Now, in a time before COVID, it used to be the third most visited country in the world. But Italy's tourism industry has been badly affected by the pandemic. Now that most of the restrictive pandemic restrictions have been lifted, restaurants, hotels and tour guides are now welcoming back foreign visitors, even if 2021 won't see a full return to normality just yet.
Tourists are trickling back to Rome, giving hope to a struggling sector that has been devastated by a year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many are delighted to board the open-topped, double-decker buses run by Big Bus Tour, offering trips around the city.
Amazing. It's been over a year and a half, and I've always liked to travel since I was young, so it feels really good to be able to leave. We're from the United States, so to be able to leave the country and visit new places.
Tourists can hop off and hop back on another bus when they get to sites where they want to spend some time. The bus makes its way past the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, and Circus Maximus. When COVID-19 started to spread in Italy, the double-decker bus business came to a screeching halt. They closed down from March 2020 until July 2021. This summer, ticket sales are picking up, but the workload is still reduced.
There are now starting to be more customers from United States because they have to be vaccinated, they have to have the green pass. We are missing the British tourists because they have to stay in the quarantine, but we see a lot of people from Europe, which are always traveling with 99% with the green pass.
On the other hand, what the Italian tourism industry has lost in international visitors is partially compensated by domestic visitors. Italy's Small Business Confederation, CGTN, reported that 13 million Italians had booked vacations in the country in August 2021, up from 10 million in August 2019. Still, with COVID-19 on the rise in many countries and new restrictions being put in place, it looks like Rome's tour operators may have to wait until next summer to return to normality. Ding Xue, CGTN.
Let's revisit an earlier story we had in the bulletin. Egypt essentially dipping a tentative toe into the market for Islamic bonds, sukuks, as they're more commonly known. Let's explore exactly what this means for the North African economy. Dr. Hisham Ibrahim is a professor of economics at Cairo University. He joins us now live on the program. Dr. Ibrahim, good to see you. So why is it taking so long for Egypt to get into the sukuk market?
Good evening. First of all, let me start by announcing that the Egyptian waiting for this new law. The Egyptian parliament approved this law last June, and we have in Egypt many mega projects need more investment, need more finance, and we don't have this instrument till now. After assigning this law from the president, I think the Egyptian economy ready now to use this new financial instrument, which common all over the world for the last 20 years. And now I think Egypt, of course, need this new instrument because we have many projects in many different economic sectors like railway, like education, like transportations. These mega projects need more investment, need more finance, and we have a problem that we have the budget deficit for this year around 6.7 from GDP, and the Egyptian government need for this rate to be calmed down. So I think this new instrument for the financial, the mega project, the public mega project, I think this instrument will use very will use recently, and I think this instrument will attract more investment from inside or from outside Egypt. I think this instrument will activate the stock market, the Egyptian stock market.
All right. So the size and the timing, though, that's yet to be determined. But given what we know about Egypt's spending plans within this financial year, what sort of size of sukuk do you think might come to market in the first half of 2022?
As Dr. Mahid, Minister of Finance, announced that this El Sukuk or the Islamic bond will be already, I think, at the end of this year or the beginning of the next year, 2022. So I think this instrument will be more activation in the stock market if it is in Egypt or outside the Egypt. I think it will give and attract more investment from Egypt and outside Egypt.
So how much do you think the government might try and tap into the market for? $500 million, $750 million compared to the green bonds that were issued in September and October last year?
I think these figures not decided till now. And I think we need more roadshow inside and outside Egypt. And I think from the result of this roadshow, we will determine what is the amount of the new issuing.
Okay, one last question for you, sir. So what about sukuks for the domestic market? Do you expect those to come to the market relatively soon next year as well?
Of course, because we have many investors like this kind of instrument, which matching with the Islamic religion. We have many investors don't like the debit bonds. So I think if the Egyptian government issuing this new instrument, I think many investors will attract this instrument. I think it will be attract many billions from inside or outside.
Indeed, we'll see how this plays out. Should be interesting to see the evolution, rather, of the debt market in Egypt. Dr. Hisham Ibrahim, the economics professor at Cairo University, joining us from Cairo. Now, on to one of the big stories around the world at this point. G7 leaders have converged for virtual crisis talks on Afghanistan. The country's refugee crisis, the collapse of the central government, and fears of a resurgence in Afghan-based terrorism have left G7 allies scrambling and also threatening the unity of the bloc in some senses. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is hosting the leaders amid widespread unhappiness from the US allies about Mr. Biden's handling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Complaints have come in from the United Kingdom, France, Germany and others in the G7, which includes only one non-NATO member, that's Japan. Mr. Johnson and others, including the French President Emmanuel Macron, are pushing Biden to extend his self-imposed August 31st deadline for the total withdrawal of American forces in order to ensure the evacuation of all foreign nationals as well as Afghans who worked for or supported the American-led NATO operation that essentially kicked the Taliban out of power back in 2001 and has now accepted defeat. So let's explore the outcomes from this virtual meeting of the G7 heads of state. Elena Casas is live in London tonight with more on the story. So, Elena, the UK, the EU, the US, they all say they're going to be holding the Taliban to account. But how exactly is that going to be done? The Taliban aren't plugged into the formal financial system. They're not even recognized by any government at this point. And assuming they stick to the August 31st deadline, G7 countries won't have troops in the country. So where's the leverage?
Well, after chairing this meeting today, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said G7 leaders have reached a roadmap for engaging with the Taliban. And this will involve, I'm quoting him here, using our very considerable influence as the G7 to engage positively with the new leadership. Now, much of the influence he's referring to there is financial. Last week, the government of Afghanistan had $9 billion in foreign reserves. That's all held in international banks, and it's now been frozen. And the British Prime Minister appeared to suggest it could be unfrozen if the Taliban abide by certain commitments, including safe passage for those wishing to leave, educating girls, and preventing the country becoming, again, I'm quoting Boris Johnson here, a breeding ground of terror or a narco state. The EU has also frozen $1 billion in development aid it had set aside for Afghanistan. And again, officials suggested today this money might still be used to support the Afghan people, but only if they can assure the rights of women and minority groups will be protected under the Taliban. So the G7 isn't without some financial leverage here. And of course, they could also impose wide-ranging sanctions on the Taliban, which they also discussed today. There was no announcement made, but of course that doesn't mean that there won't be further down the line.
Was there any joint agreement from today's meeting on a joint resettlement program among the G7 states for the Afghans who worked with coalition forces over the last 2 decades?
Well, G7 countries said they would support UN efforts to coordinate help for refugees in the region, and the EU has said it will offer financial help for member countries who step up to take in refugees. European countries aren't really on the same page here. Some countries that did take part in NATO operations in Afghanistan, like Hungary and Austria, are refusing to accept any refugees at all, while Spain, contrastingly, has offered itself as a hub for refugees who worked with Western countries. The thing is, though, that right now the question of where vulnerable Afghans will go has been overwhelmed in the last few days by the sheer logistical difficulty of getting them out of the country at all, especially now that the Taliban is blocking access to the airport. Countries in the NATO coalition, including the US and the UK, do say they have a responsibility towards those Afghans who helped them. They are trying to get them out, but it does increasingly look like many of those people will simply be unable to reach the airport in time.
Indeed. Just to give our viewers a sense of the scale of the logistical challenge here, some 58,000 people have been moved out of the airport in the last 10 days. So the last time the Taliban were in charge, though, they were barely recognized by most governments around the world. Would the G7 use the same approach this time, withholding effectively formal recognition of the Taliban?
Well, we know that they're determined to agree on a joint approach towards if or when they might recognise the Taliban. Boris Johnson today said we've agreed a roadmap for the way in which we're going to engage with the Taliban, since there probably will be a Taliban government in Kabul. Of course, he's just accepting reality there, but it does leave a door open to some kind of engagement with that Taliban government as long as it commits to upholding the rights of women and international humanitarian law. At the moment, of course, assuring the safety of vulnerable Afghans is the immediate priority, and Western governments have yet to see how the Taliban govern this time round. So it is a bit soon to say, but the G7 do seem to be suggesting international funds could still be made available if the Taliban does meet certain commitments.
Okay, so one last question. The August 31st withdrawal deadline, that's now just days away, essentially, roughly, well, actually less than a week away. The Taliban clearly don't want any Western forces around after that date. So where does this leave the push by the UK to extend that evacuation deadline?
Well, Boris Johnson, along with the French President Emmanuel Macron, did try to persuade the US at this meeting to extend that deadline today, and it does seem that they've been unsuccessful. American officials say they're concerned about possible Islamic State bombings at the airport, and they want to get all US troops out before an attack happens. So that means that British troops have only a few days left to finish their evacuations and leave. They will need to go before the last American soldiers. And the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, has been stressing today that British troops are working flat out at the airport, and Britain has evacuated more than 2,000 people in the last 24 hours and is confident, according to the minister, that thousands more Afghans who worked with British forces can be got out. But it's clear now that those evacuation efforts are really against the clock.
Indeed, we'll see how this does play out. Elena Casas there joining us live from London. Let's now turn to the Chinese city of Chongqing, where the 2021 Smart China Expo is underway. The country's head of state, Xi Jinping, sent a congratulatory letter to the expo a little earlier. CGTN's Nicole Ng takes a look at a Chinese firm that's hoping to make firefighting a lot more safer by having robots do it. There's that report on what's hot tonight.
They say robots may take our jobs one day, but what if those jobs are incredibly dangerous for humans? That's one of the reasons Chinese company Sevens developed this rover-looking robot. Not only can it handle extreme temperatures, it's also useful when there are chemical fumes and explosive substances. The camera on top able to analyze when a situation is dangerous.
Of course, we have our own brain inside the machine. Without a brain, you cannot call it a robot. It's just a machine, regular machine, right? So the brain works with this data to identify, is it a danger, is it a leakage, or is it just a normal warming up?
Then there are the manual tasks. The robot is able to work 24 hours straight and pull a hose that normally requires the strength of 10 men. It means a bit of reprieve for firefighters. And despite costing over $100,000, more than a dozen fire brigades in China have added one to their inventory.
The robots are designed and manufactured here in Chongqing. It's a city looking to make a name for itself as a hub for smart technologies. This model, in fact, was unveiled at this very expo just 2 years ago, and the company has since been focusing mainly on the safety industry.
We found out that the emergency safety industry has a very big potential market. So we will be launching more and more specific specialized robotic products in future to help people in these dangerous industries to have safer working environment.
For Sevens, carving out its own niche has been a good strategy. It now holds the biggest market share in China and is eyeing global expansion, meaning robots taking over the world. But for the sake of safety, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Nicole Ng, CGTN.
Quick run through commodity prices. Let's start with Brent crude. It did rally today, back over $70 a barrel for the first time in 10 days. Analysts over at S&P Platts are pointing out that inventories, incidentally, also rising back to levels we last saw 3 months ago. There's an estimated 152 million barrels of oil in floating storage. It's a rather boring term for simply saying there's a lot of oil stored in oil tankers, but it's also a pointer to how uneven the recovery in oil demand has been. That's roughly 60%, incidentally, of where those inventories were in June 2020, 3 months after the WHO declared the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how hydroponics is gaining popularity among farmers in Tanzania when we return.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Aden, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys,
The greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Smart hydroponics could soon help urban dwellers in Tanzania grow their own crops, their own veggie supply in small spaces at a relatively low cost. At the moment, the bulk of the country's food is grown by smallholder farmers who are highly vulnerable to climate change, partly because of their heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture. CGTN's Isaac Lucando visited Tanzania's largest hydroponics farm and he filed this report for Grassroots.
This lettuce is growing on rows of plastic pipes that circulate water. Mwamvua Mlangwa, the largest hydroponics farmer in Tanzania, learnt about this soilless, eco-friendly farming method on a trip to Israel. She says the lack of knowledge on smart hydroponics for many in the country has made financing her 4-year-old vegetable farm difficult.
I tried to source funds from the existing banks. By the time they didn't know what I'm talking about, because there was nobody doing hydroponic in Tanzania, so I had to use my own funds.
Mwami grows her vegetables on half an acre of land using fertilizer that dissolves in water, which is then recycled. She says with the assistance of a mobile app, a small space can yield up to 500% more than ordinary farms, while reducing water usage by 90%.
There's some app which you can download to control the nutrients which are coming on the plants. So you can do that when you see the nutrients are lower. Once you are connected to the internet, that app can tell you that like, the nutrients are lower, then you can come and add the nutrients.
Although global adoption rates for hydroponics are on the rise, Mwami says the country's adoption rate is still very low. To remedy that, she has begun passing her knowledge on the subject to university students studying agriculture.
The United Nations projects that the global population will reach 10 billion people by 2050, with roughly 83 million people added to the world's population each year until then. With less farming land available, hydroponics might just be the way to meet the world's growing food needs.
Although food is sufficient, Tanzania's overdependence on rain-fed agriculture often leads to low, unreliable and inconsistent productivity in the agricultural sector. With the potential use of less farmland, the government is looking to use methods like hydroponics to boost productivity.
What are we getting? Productivity is not about how many hours we spend working, not just about farm implements. It's also about the area you use to farm and what we have harvested.
Mwami sells her produce to major hotels, supermarkets and restaurants in the country. She's hoping that this soilless method of farming will grow to become the norm for farmers and urban dwellers across Tanzania. Isaac Lucando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Finally, South Africa's prolonged pandemic restrictions have forced many an entrepreneur to completely reinvent their business from the ground up if they are to survive. Those in the export and the tourism sectors have been particularly hard hit, with both sectors yet to fully recover. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire now taking a look at a business that remodeled itself from the ground up in order to survive.
Business was booming for Durban-based Afri-crafters. Overseas orders were rolling in and it had a steady flow of work for its creatives until the coronavirus pandemic hit.
So we all, like the rest of the world, had to just take a big breath, sit back and watch everything unfold and decide we could either just fold at that point in time, or we could just wait and see what would happen, which is what we did.
The months to follow were tough, but founder Lucretia Poulton knuckled down, set expansion plans in motion, and opened shop at one of Durban's prime tourist spots.
We had already had plans to come into Shaka Marine World. Part of our rollout plan was to enter a major tourist destination where we could start our flagship store. When lockdown eased off around about October, November last year, we opened in the hope that we could have recovered all of our losses over the December period. Unfortunately, we went into level 3, which then impacted us hugely again because we had no tourists.
To worsen matters, KwaZulu-Natal was hit by the worst looting and violence in years, which disrupted supply chains and caused further reputational damage.
It's been hard. And like those bags, it's a tourist that they love, and even the local, but not that much. I think it will come right, but I don't know when it will come right. But my hope is say it will come right.
It has slowed down a lot, but it gave me enough time to also be able to come up with new designs. You see, during quiet times when everything is quiet and everybody's almost like dead, I get some time to come up with more creativity and innovate more.
I try not to dwell into into the negatives too much. So I try to work more on what can I do in this current time that I'm facing, in changing my movements in the more positive direction.
Poulton's business has barely stayed afloat, but she hasn't given up. She's investing further in her artists who create a range of products, including handbags, clothing, and metal art from recycled drums and car parts.
So we are in the process of considering manufacturing. We haven't quite decided what we're going to be doing, but together with the entrepreneurs that fall under my banner, we intend to have a meeting and sit down and brainstorm a few ideas as to how we could take this entire thing forward in terms of manufacturing.
South Africa remains on lockdown level 3. The slow rollout of vaccines has held back economic recovery, but Poulton and many others are hoping the situation will soon start to turn around as the vaccine program gains momentum. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
And a quick run through the currencies. Let's start with South Africa and the rand. It did report some pretty dismal unemployment data as reported earlier at the start of the hour. But the rand continues its run of incremental gains against the American dollar. Even today, it's hovering just around the $15 rather to the dollar rand level. The last 4 weeks have been pretty good as well for Zambia's currency, even if its gains against the American dollar now sort of tapering off. It was 1.7% stronger against the greenback, taking its gains over the last 4 weeks to 14.25%. Kenya's currency over in East Africa does continue its gradual weakening against the American dollar, and the interbank market, it's been hovering around 109.50 for the time being. When will it reach 110? Can't tell, but when it does, you'll find out here. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program. Many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.